a crowded room, laughter around you. And yet, something inside stays very, very quiet. Not because nothing is wrong, but because you've learned, somewhere along the way, that showing what's wrong is the most dangerous thing you can do. So, you smile. You answer, "I'm fine." You carry the weight in silence, the way a person carries a heavy bag and pretends it isn't heavy at all. And the strange part? No one notices, which means you did it perfectly. But here's the question that stays with you long after the room goes quiet. If hiding yourself so well is a kind of success, why does it feel so much like being lost? Nobody is born with armor. If you watch a very young child, you see it clearly. They cry when they are sad. They laugh without checking if it's appropriate. They say I'm scared without feeling embarrassed about it. They reach out their arms when they need to be held, and they do it without hesitation, without shame, without a second thought. They are completely open, completely honest, completely themselves. And then, slowly, that begins to change. Not because of one big moment, not because of one harsh word or one bad day. It happens in small, quiet lessons. Lessons that nobody writes down, but everyone somehow learns. A child falls and starts to cry. An adult nearby says, "Don't cry, be strong." The child doesn't fully understand the words yet, but they understand the message. Tears are something to be ashamed of. Weakness is something to hide. A teenager feels nervous before speaking in class. They admit it to a friend. The friend laughs. Not cruelly, just casually. But it's enough. The teenager learns, don't say how you feel out loud. Keep it inside. These moments stack, one on top of another, year after year. And here is something worth knowing. This is not just a personal experience. It is a cultural one. Across many societies, emotional restraint has long been seen as a sign of maturity and strength. In some East Asian cultures, the concept of saving face, protecting yourself and others from public embarrassment, runs so deep that showing emotional pain in public is considered almost disrespectful. In many Western cultures, the old ideal of the self-made person, someone who handles everything alone, who needs no one, has been celebrated for generations. The message, no matter where you grow up, tends to point in the same direction. Handle it yourself. Don't burden others. Don't show the cracks. And so we learn to perform. We learn to answer fine before anyone finishes asking, "How are you?" We learn to laugh things off, the rejections, the failures, the quiet grief that doesn't have a name. We learn to build a version of ourselves that is acceptable, presentable, untroubling to others. My friends, this is where it begins. Not in weakness, but in a kind of intelligence. A child's mind is incredibly good at reading the room. It notices what gets rewarded and what gets ignored. It notices what makes people comfortable and what makes them pull away. And it adapts, because adapting is how we survive. But here is what that young, intelligent, adapting mind did not yet understand. There is a difference between surviving and living. Survival says, hide what hurts, keep moving, don't let them see. Living says something different, something quieter, something most of us were never taught to hear. We will get to that. But first, let's follow the armor a little further, because once we learn to wear it, something unexpected happens. We stop thinking of it as armor at all. We start thinking of it as who we are. The armor doesn't feel like armor after a while. That's the thing nobody warns you about. When you wear something long enough, when you carry it through enough mornings, enough conversations, enough years, it stops feeling like something you put on. It starts feeling like skin. And this is exactly when a personal habit becomes something much larger. It becomes a system. Think about how an ordinary day is structured for most people. You wake up and prepare a face for the world. Not just physically, but emotionally. You decide, often without realizing it, which parts of yourself are allowed out today, and which parts must stay behind the door. You walk into work, into school, into a social gathering, and you perform. Not in a dishonest way, not even consciously, but you perform nonetheless, adjusting your tone, softening your edges, shrinking certain feelings so they don't take up too much space. And the world responds warmly to this. The colleague who never complains gets described as professional. The friend who always seems cheerful gets called such good energy. The person who shares nothing difficult is labeled easy to be around, without anyone saying it directly. A quiet agreement forms between people. We will show each other the comfortable parts, and we will call that closeness. Psychologists have a term for the version of yourself you present to the outside world, the persona. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, described it as a kind of social mask that every person develops. It serves a real purpose. It helps us navigate different situations, different relationships, different expectations. In that sense, it is not a lie, it is a tool. But tools can become traps, because once the persona becomes the only version of you that other people ever see, once the mask is on so consistently that even you forget it's there, something underneath begins to quietly suffocate. A woman in her mid-30s once described it this way. At work, she was known as the calm one. The one who never panicked, never asked for help, never showed when something was too much. Colleagues admired her for it. Her manager praised her composure, and she felt proud, genuinely proud, of how well she held herself together. It was only late at night, alone in her apartment, that she realized no one actually knew her. They knew her performance. They appreciated it, but they had never met the person underneath it. My friends, this is how the system forms. Not through force, not through cruelty, but through a long series of small rewards. A smile here, a compliment there, a sense of belonging that comes when you fit smoothly into the shape others expect. And so, we keep fitting. We keep smoothing. We keep editing ourselves into something easier to accept, until one day the distance between the person we perform and the person we actually are becomes so wide, so quietly enormous, that crossing it feels almost impossible. That distance has a cost, and it is higher than most of us ever expected to pay. At some point, the protection stops protecting. It happens quietly. There is no single moment you can point to, no clear before and after, just a slow creeping awareness that something important has gone missing. And the unsettling part is that you built the very walls that keep you from finding it. This is the hidden cost of emotional armor. Not the dramatic collapse, not the obvious breakdown, but the quiet, daily experience of being surrounded by people and still feeling completely alone. Because here is what armor actually does. Beneath all its usefulness, it doesn't just keep pain out, it keeps everything out. The walls you build to protect yourself from judgment also block genuine warmth from reaching you. The distance you create to avoid being hurt also prevents you from being truly known. You stay safe, and you stay separate, both at the same time. Loneliness, in its deepest form, is not about being physically alone. Research in social psychology has consistently shown that people can feel profoundly lonely inside relationships, inside friendships, inside families, whenever they feel that the version of themselves others see is not the version that is real. It is the loneliness of being witnessed but not seen, of being present but not known. And over time, that kind of loneliness does something to a person. It makes you tired in a way that sleep cannot fix. Not physically tired, but tired of managing. Tired of tracking which version of yourself is appropriate for which room. Tired of the constant low-level performance that has become so normal you almost forget it's happening. A man in his 40s once said something that stayed with people long after he said it. He had spent most of his adult life being described as steady, reliable, composed. His friends came to him with their problems because he always seemed to have answers. He was the strong one, the stable one. And then one evening, sitting with a close friend over a simple cup of tea, he said quietly, "I don't think anyone has ever actually asked me how I am and waited for a real answer." His friend didn't know what to say, because it was true. They had never asked. They had assumed he was fine because he always looked fine, because he had taught everyone around him to assume exactly that. My friends, this is the cost that doesn't appear in any visible ledger. It doesn't show up as a wound you can point to. It shows up as a gradual erosion of intimacy, of authenticity, of the sense that you are truly, fully alive inside your own life. And perhaps the cruelest part of all, the stronger your armor becomes, the harder it is to believe anyone would accept what's underneath it. You hide for so long that hiding starts to feel like the only safe option. The vulnerability you buried begins to feel like a liability rather than a truth. But it was always a truth. It was always, underneath everything, just you. Something is shifting. Not everywhere, not all at once, but quietly, noticeably, in the way that real change always begins. through individual people deciding, one by one, that the old way is no longer working for them. For a long time, vulnerability was treated as a personal failure, something to manage privately and never mention publicly. But in recent years, that understanding has begun to move. Conversations that once happened only in therapy rooms or late-night phone calls are finding their way into workplaces, classrooms, public stages. People are starting to say out loud and without apology, "I am struggling. I don't have this figured out. I need help." And something unexpected is happening in response. Instead of rejection, connection. The researcher, Brené Brown, spent over 2 decades studying human connection, shame, and vulnerability. What she found was not what most people expected. Vulnerability, the willingness to show up honestly without guarantees, was not the opposite of strength. It was, in fact, the foundation of it. It was the birthplace of creativity, belonging, and meaningful relationship. Her work reached millions of people not because it was complicated, but because it named something they had already felt but never had words for. That feeling has a name now. And naming something changes your relationship with it. In many modern workplaces, leaders who acknowledge uncertainty, who say, "I don't know," or "I made a mistake," are increasingly trusted more, not less, than those who project constant confidence. Studies in organizational behavior suggest that teams led by people who model emotional honesty tend to feel safer, communicate more openly, and perform with greater creativity. The performance of invulnerability, it turns out, is not just personally costly, it is collectively costly too. And on a more intimate level, in friendships and relationships, the same pattern appears. A young woman exhausted from years of presenting only her best self online and in person made a quiet decision one year. She began answering "How are you?" honestly. Not dramatically, not with a flood of emotion, just honestly. "Actually, I've been a bit low lately. I've been overwhelmed this week." Small, real answers. She expected people to pull away. Instead, something else happened. People leaned in. They shared their own quiet struggles. Conversations that had once stayed on the surface began to go somewhere deeper. Not because everything suddenly became serious, but because something real had finally entered the room. My friends, this is what normalization looks like when it moves in the right direction. Not a trend, not a performance of openness replacing a performance of strength, but a genuine, growing recognition that the human experience, in all its uncertainty, all its tenderness, all its unfinished edges, is not something to be corrected. It is something to be shared. The world does not become more connected when everyone pretends to be whole. It becomes more connected when people are brave enough, quietly, imperfectly brave enough to show where they are still learning to heal. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The word vulnerable comes from the Latin vulnerabor, meaning to wound. For most of history, that origin shaped how people understood the idea. To be vulnerable was to be woundable, exposed, at risk. And so the natural response was always the same: cover it, guard it, make sure no one could reach the soft place underneath. But perhaps the original meaning was pointing at something different than we thought. Not weakness, not damage, but openness. The simple, profound willingness to exist without a wall between yourself and the world. Because here is what a life fully behind armor actually looks like when you stand back far enough to see it clearly. It is safe. It is functional. It moves through the days without too much disruption. But it is also, in a very quiet, very real way, unlived. You cannot selectively numb yourself. When you close the door on pain, you close it on joy too. When you stop letting people see what hurts, you also stop letting them see what moves you, what lights you up, what makes you undeniably, specifically, irreplaceably you. The philosopher Martin Buber wrote about the difference between two kinds of human relationship. One he called I-it, where we relate to others as objects, as functions, as roles they play in our lives. The other he called I-thou, a rare, genuine meeting between two full human beings. Buber believed that real connection, the kind that actually nourishes a person, only happens in that second space, and that second space requires something from both people. It requires presence, it requires honesty, it requires, at the most essential level, a willingness to be seen. Vulnerability is not the obstacle to that kind of connection. It is the door. My friends, we spend so much of our lives becoming better at hiding, better at performing, better at presenting versions of ourselves that are easier, smoother, less complicated, and in doing so, we become strangers, not only to others, but slowly, gradually to ourselves. Stopping that is not a dramatic act. It does not require a grand confession or a public unraveling. It begins in the smallest moments. A pause before saying, "I'm fine," when you are not. A quiet admission to someone you trust that things have been hard. A decision to let one real feeling exist in the open air, just for a moment, without immediately pushing it back down. These small acts of honesty are not signs of falling apart. They are signs of coming back together. And every time you allow yourself to be genuinely seen, even imperfectly, even nervously, even just a little, you give the people around you silent permission to do the same. You make the room slightly safer, the world slightly warmer, the distance between human beings slightly smaller. That is not nothing. In fact, my friends, that might be everything. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.